The house was so quiet that morning that he could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen, a sound that usually went unnoticed but now felt oppressively loud in the silence. Outside the tall bay windows of their home in Riverside Heights, the December rain fell in steady sheets, creating a gray, blurred landscape that matched the hollowness spreading through his chest. But inside everything felt different. Wrong. The kind of wrong that doesn't announce itself with a bang, but creeps in slowly, like cold air seeping through a crack in the wall. He had come home just after noon on December 26th, still riding the fading warmth of the previous night. His affair with Natasha, the marketing director from the downtown office, had left him intoxicated with a kind of reckless confidence. He'd convinced himself that what he was doing was justified, that his wife Rachel simply didn't understand him anymore, that they had drifted so far apart that lying had become easier than truth. The Christmas dinner at that intimate Italian restaurant in the Waterfront District, the stolen moments at the boutique hotel on Clearview Avenue, the way Natasha had laughed at his jokes, it all felt like proof that he still mattered, that he was still desirable, that his marriage had simply run its course. Before we dive back in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if this story resonates with you, don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is something truly special I can't wait to share. But the moment he stepped through the front door of the two-story house on Oakmont Drive that he and Rachel had bought together 5 years ago, he knew something was catastrophically wrong. The air felt different. Not just cold, but abandoned. The kind of emptiness that comes when a place has been deliberately left, when someone has walked out with intention and finality. He called her name, expecting the usual sounds, her footsteps from upstairs, the kitchen faucet, maybe music playing softly in the background. The silence that answered him was deafening. He moved through the living room in a daze. The Christmas tree they had decorated together just weeks before still stood in the corner, its lights still plugged in, still blinking methodically as if nothing had changed. But everything had. The stockings that hung above the fireplace, the ones Rachel had carefully chosen, personalizing each one with their names embroidered in gold thread, now looked like relics from another lifetime. They swayed slightly from the draft of the door he'd just opened, as if caught between two worlds. That's when he saw the dining room table. It was arranged with a precision that felt almost ceremonial. The papers were impossible to miss, a perfectly organized stack that seemed to grow larger the longer he stared at it. Divorce documents, property settlement agreements, bank statements, mortgage refinancing papers, real estate listing agreements, house appraisal forms. Everything was highlighted in yellow where his signature would need to go. Everything was organized. Everything was final. His hands began to shake as he approached the table, as if the closer he got to the papers, the more real they would become. But they were already real. He could feel it in his bones, in the tightness spreading across his chest, in the way his breathing had become shallow and uneven. On top of the stack of documents lay a single envelope. His name was written on it in handwriting he knew as well as his own. Rachel's handwriting. Steady. Controlled. Final. With trembling fingers, he opened it. Inside was a handwritten note. Just a few lines. No anger. No accusations. No pleas or explanations. Just words that hit him like a physical blow. I stopped waiting for you to become the person I married. I stopped hoping you would choose us. I stopped believing in the promises you made. I've chosen peace, and I've chosen myself. Sign what needs to be signed. Everything else is already in motion. By the time you read this, the house is listed, the legal process has begun, and I am no longer waiting for you to understand what you've done. I am no longer waiting for your apology or your excuses. I am simply gone. There was no signature, no love, no sincerely, no closing that suggested anything other than complete finality. Just those words. Those devastating, crystal-clear words that made it impossible for him to pretend, to rationalize, to convince himself that this was temporary or that there was still time to fix it. His phone, The same phone that had been buzzing with messages from Natasha all morning suddenly felt unbearably heavy in his pocket. He pulled it out with numb fingers and tried to call Rachel. The phone went straight to voicemail. Her voicemail box was full. He tried texting. The messages showed as delivered, but were never marked as read. He tried again, and again, and again. 23 times he called her that day. 23 times the phone went to voicemail. As he stood there in the dining room, surrounded by the evidence of his wife's meticulous planning, the full weight of his actions crashed down on him with a force that made his knees buckle. This wasn't a momentary lapse. This wasn't something that could be fixed with flowers or promises or romantic gestures. This was the end. This was Rachel finally reaching the limit of what she could endure, and instead of fighting for their marriage, instead of giving him a chance to explain or apologize or change, she had simply walked away. The Christmas tree lights continued to blink in the background. Cheerful, mocking, indifferent. He sank into the dining room chair, the divorce papers scattered in front of him like the ruins of a life he'd taken for granted, and for the first time in years, he truly understood what it meant to have lost everything that mattered. They met on a Tuesday in late September at the Riverside Public Library, in the section where all the old vinyl records were stored. David had gone there looking for a specific recording of Coltrane's A Love Supreme, one his father had owned decades ago and that he'd been trying to track down for months. Rachel was standing at the same shelf, her fingers trailing along the worn spines of the albums, searching for something too. When they both reached for the same record, a reissue of Miles Davis's Kind of Blue, their hands collided gently, and they both laughed in that awkward way strangers do when they realize they're looking for the same thing. David pulled back first, offering her the record with a self-deprecating smile. "I think you found it first," he said, even though they'd both reached at the exact same moment. "No, I insist," Rachel said, her eyes crinkling at the corners when she smiled. "Besides, I've heard this one 100 times. You look like you actually need it." That small act of kindness, that willingness to let him have something she wanted, should have been a warning. It was the beginning of a pattern that would define their entire relationship. Rachel always letting him have what he wanted. Rachel always stepping back. Rachel always choosing peace over conflict. But on that September afternoon, standing in the dusty light of the library, David didn't think about patterns or warnings. He only knew that he wanted to know more about this woman with kind eyes and an easy laugh. He asked if she wanted to get coffee. She said yes. Coffee turned into lunch at a small bistro on Maple Street called the Vintage Cup. Lunch turned into dinner at an upscale restaurant downtown. They talked for hours that first day, about music and books, about their families and their dreams, about the places they wanted to travel and the lives they imagined building. She told him about growing up in Portland with two sisters, about how her father had died when she was young, about how she'd learned to be independent early. He told her about his career as a financial analyst, about his ambitions to climb higher in his firm, about his desire to build a life that meant something. By the time the restaurant was closing, David knew he wanted to see her again. More than that, he knew he wanted to build something with her. The early years of their relationship were golden. They felt like a movie they were both starring in, the kind of love story people write songs about. They took weekend trips to the coast, driving up to the small town of Seaside where they'd rent a cabin and spend days reading by the window or walking along the beach. They cooked together in their apartment on Elm Avenue, attempting recipes from elaborate cookbooks, laughing when things burned or turned out nothing like the picture. They supported each other through career changes and family crises. When Rachel got promoted to senior editor at her publishing company, David took her out and told her he'd always known she was brilliant. When David's mother got sick, Rachel sat in the hospital waiting room with him for entire afternoons, holding his hand without saying anything, just being there. He proposed on a rainy evening in November, at the same library where they'd met. He'd arranged to have the lights dimmed, and when she walked into the vinyl section, he was standing there with the Kind of Blue album in his hand and a diamond ring in his other. She cried. She said yes before he'd even finished asking the question. "I want to spend my whole life with you," he told her, and he meant it. Every word. The wedding was small but beautiful, just family and close friends at a garden venue in the rolling hills outside the city. Rachel wore her grandmother's lace veil and looked like she was glowing from the inside out. David wore his father's cufflinks and felt like the luckiest man alive. When they exchanged vows, he meant every single promise. To have and to hold. For better or for worse. In sickness and in health. Till death do us part. They bought the house on Oakmont Drive 3 years later, using the down payment they'd saved together. It was an older home, built in the 1970s, with beautiful hardwood floors and a fireplace that actually worked. It needed work, but they didn't care. They saw potential. They saw a place where they could build a life, maybe raise a family someday, grow old together. They painted the bedroom walls together. They refinished the kitchen cabinets on weekends. They planted a garden in the backyard, though neither of them knew much about gardening. For those first 5 years of marriage, David felt like he had everything. A beautiful wife who loved him, a career that was advancing, a home that was becoming theirs, friends they'd built a life around, holidays spent with extended family, traditions they were creating together. It felt stable. It felt real. It felt like the life he'd always wanted. But somewhere along the way, without either of them quite noticing it happening, things had begun to shift. The shifts were small at first. Almost imperceptible. He'd work late and not call to tell her. She'd wait dinner for him and eventually eat alone. He'd be distant when she wanted to talk, buried in his phone or his laptop, thinking about work problems instead of being present with her. She'd mention wanting to take a trip together, and he'd say maybe next year, knowing deep down that next year probably wouldn't happen either. Rachel had tried to address it. He could see that now, looking back. She'd asked him if everything was okay between them. She'd suggested couples therapy. She'd told him she missed him, even though he was standing right there in the room. But David had dismissed her concerns, telling her she was being too sensitive, that everything was fine, that she was imagining problems that didn't exist. He had been so sure he was right, so confident in his own narrative that their marriage was solid, that they were fine, that there was nothing that needed fixing. He had no idea how wrong he was. And he had no idea that the woman who had once stepped aside to let him have what he wanted would eventually step aside one final time, not to give him something, but to remove herself from his life entirely. The first real change came so subtly that David didn't recognize it as a beginning. It started with his phone. Rachel noticed it before anything else shifted. He would keep his phone face down on the dinner table, something he'd never done before. When it buzzed or lit up, he'd glance at it quickly and then flip it over again, as if the device itself might betray him if he didn't keep it under control. When she'd ask him who had messaged or called, he'd give vague answers. Just work stuff. Nothing important. Just Marcus from the office. His tone would have a defensive edge to it that hadn't been there before, a sharpness that made her hesitate before asking follow-up questions. Rachel wasn't naturally suspicious by nature. She had grown up in a household where trust was the foundation of everything. Her mother had taught her that jealousy and paranoia were poison to a relationship, that the best way to build something lasting was to believe in the other person, to give them the benefit of the doubt. So when her instincts first whispered that something was off with David, she pushed them away. She told herself she was being insecure. She reminded herself of all the reasons she trusted him. She convinced herself that his secretiveness was probably just about some work project or maybe a surprise he was planning for her birthday. But the phone was only the beginning. Around that same time, his late work nights became more frequent. He'd call around 7 or 8 in the evening and tell her he had to stay late at the office, that there was a client meeting running long or a project deadline that couldn't wait until tomorrow. Rachel would ask him when he'd be home, and he'd give vague time frames. Not sure, maybe 10 or 11. Sometimes he'd text her at midnight to say he was staying even later. Other times he wouldn't contact her at all, and she'd lie awake in their bed, wondering if she should be worried or if she was overreacting. His firm, Harrison and Associates Financial Group, was in the downtown business district about 20 minutes from their house. Or so Rachel thought. It wasn't until much later that she realized he could have been anywhere during those hours. The office building was just the cover story, the narrative he'd woven that made his absences sound logical and explainable and entirely work-related. When Rachel suggested they take a vacation, something they hadn't done in over a year, David's response was unexpectedly harsh. "Not right now," he said. "Work is crazy. I can't take the time off." But then a week later, she'd see him casually texting on his phone with a small smile on his face, looking more relaxed than he'd looked in months. When she asked who he was talking to, he snapped at her. "Can't I have any privacy? Do you have to know everything I'm doing every second of the day?" The comment stung because it wasn't like him. The David she knew was patient. He didn't snap. He didn't make her feel like she was being unreasonable for wanting to be close to him. But she swallowed the hurt and apologized for asking, told him she was sorry for prying, even though she wasn't really prying at all. She was just trying to maintain the connection they'd had, trying to stay close to a man who was actively moving away from her. Then there were the small comments. Throwaway remarks that didn't make sense until much later, when she understood what they really meant. One evening, she came into the living room where he was sitting on the couch, and she kissed him on the forehead the way she'd done 1,000 times before. He flinched. Not dramatically, just a slight pulling away, as if her touch had become uncomfortable to him. When she pulled back and looked at him questioningly, he gave her a tight smile and said, "I'm just tired. Sorry." But the moment had felt like a small rejection, a subtle message that she wasn't welcome in the space she was supposed to share with him. Another time, she was folding his laundry, something she'd always done as an act of love, a small domestic gesture that made her feel like they were building a life together, and she noticed a stain on one of his shirts. It was a makeup stain, dark and smudged on the collar. Her heart had stopped for just a moment, but then she rationalized it away. Maybe he'd hugged a female colleague. Maybe it was old and she'd never noticed it before. Maybe she was being paranoid. She didn't ask him about it. She simply threw the shirt in the wash and pretended she hadn't seen anything. There was the Saturday afternoon when she came home from running errands and found him in the garage, supposedly organizing his tools. But his hands weren't dirty. He wasn't actually doing anything. He was just standing there with his phone pressed to his ear, and when he saw her, he quickly ended the call. "Wrong number," he said when she asked who he'd been talking to. But his face was flushed, and his eyes wouldn't quite meet hers. Rachel started noticing other things too. The way he'd suddenly become concerned about his appearance in a way he'd never been before. He started going to the gym 3, 4, sometimes 5 times a week. He bought new clothes, expensive ones from upscale stores downtown. He had his hair styled differently. He started wearing cologne, something she'd never known him to wear before. When she commented on how good he looked, he brushed off the compliment as if it were nothing. "Just trying to take better care of myself," he said. "I've been letting myself go." But she hadn't thought he was letting himself go. She thought he was beautiful the way he was. And the sudden transformation felt less like self-care and more like preparation for someone else's eyes. The arguments, when they started, came out of nowhere. David would be irritable about small things. If dinner was 5 minutes late, he'd be annoyed. If she asked him about his day, he'd snap at her for interrogating him. If she suggested they spend a weekend together, he'd accuse her of being clingy and needy. Rachel found herself walking on eggshells, measuring her words, trying not to say anything that might set him off. She stopped asking questions. She stopped suggesting things. She made herself smaller in an attempt to keep the peace. She told herself this was what marriage was supposed to be. People grew apart sometimes. People went through phases. Maybe this was just a rough patch, and if she was patient and understanding and didn't make waves, they'd get through it. Everyone had flaws. Everyone made mistakes. Love meant overlooking the little things, didn't it? She didn't realize that those little things, the phone face down on the table, the late nights with vague explanations, the flinching away from her touch, the new clothes and the cologne and the sudden gym routine, the makeup stain she'd pretended not to see, weren't actually little things at all. They were breadcrumbs. A trail leading directly to the truth that she was too afraid to follow. And by the time she finally understood what those breadcrumbs meant, she'd been ignoring them for so long that she'd lost the ability to speak up about it. She'd taught herself not to see. She'd learned to rationalize. She'd convinced herself that her doubts were her own insecurity, her own jealousy, her own paranoia getting in the way of a good thing. She had no idea how carefully those little things would eventually erode everything they'd built together. She had no idea that her silence, her acceptance, her willingness to overlook what her gut was screaming at her to acknowledge, that those things would become the foundation upon which her own departure would eventually be built. The moment the truth became undeniable arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in late October, exactly 1 month before Christmas. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the kind of discovery that should have been this earth-shattering, but it was. The revelation came not from a confession or a confrontation, but from something far simpler and far more devastating, a notification on his phone. David was in the shower. Rachel was in their bedroom, gathering laundry from the floor, when his phone buzzed on the nightstand. It had been buzzing all morning with messages he'd been dismissing with quick glances and brief replies. But this one was different. This one showed a preview on the lock screen before it disappeared. The message was from someone named Natasha. The preview read, "Can't wait to see you tonight. I've missed you so much. Our place at 7. Rachel's hands froze. The shirt she'd been holding fell to the floor. For a moment, she couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. Couldn't do anything but stare at the space where the message had been, as if by concentrating hard enough, she could make it disappear, could rewind time to 30 seconds ago when she still didn't know what she now knew. She picked up the phone with trembling hands. The lock screen had gone dark, but she knew his passcode. She'd always known it. 4 years, they hadn't kept secrets from each other. They'd shared passwords, left their phones in plain sight, never thought twice about the other person needing to check something. That trust felt naive now. That openness suddenly felt like it had been a weapon against her. Her fingers moved on autopilot as she entered the code. 4 digits. Numbers that represented their anniversary month and day. How cruel that even his passcode was built on a lie. The messages came up on the screen, and Rachel felt the world tilt beneath her feet. There were hundreds of them. Hundreds. Going back months. Intimate messages. Photographs. Conversations that ranged from purely sexual to deeply emotional. There were messages where David had told Natasha that he didn't love his wife anymore. Messages where he'd said he felt trapped in his marriage. Messages where he'd talked about planning to leave, about starting a new life with someone who actually understood him. "She's so controlling," he'd written in one message. "She wants to know everything I'm doing, everywhere I'm going. I can't breathe in this relationship anymore." Rachel had to grip the edge of the nightstand to keep from falling. She wasn't controlling. She'd never been controlling. She'd stepped back. She'd given him space. She'd ignored the red flags because she'd wanted so badly to believe in him, to believe in them. And yet here he was, painting her as the villain in a narrative that was entirely his own creation. There were photos. Photographs that made her stomach turn. Pictures of David with a woman she'd never seen before, a woman with long dark hair and a bright smile, a woman who looked at him the way Rachel had once looked at him. The way she still looked at him, even though he'd clearly stopped looking at her that way years ago. In one photo, they were at the restaurant on the waterfront, the one that had become their place apparently, a place where David was creating memories with another woman while Rachel waited at home, wondering why he was always working late. In another photo, they were at the Clearview Avenue hotel, wrapped around each other in a bed that wasn't theirs, in a room that belonged to no one but seemed to belong completely to them. The messages grew more recent as Rachel scrolled through them. There were texts from just this morning. Natasha asking him what time he could get away. David responding that he'd figure something out, that he always did. Rachel realized that she'd been the obstacle. She'd been the problem that needed managing, the complication that required careful maneuvering and strategic lies. While she'd been home making dinner and waiting for him and hoping things would get better, he'd been systematically building an entire second life. Not with passion or recklessness, but with cold, calculated precision. The shower shut off. David would be out in minutes. Rachel's hands shook as she put the phone back exactly where it had been, on the nightstand. She sat down on the edge of the bed and tried to make her face neutral, tried to prepare herself for the performance she'd have to give. David emerged from the bathroom wrapped in a towel, steam rising around him. He seemed lighter than he had in months, almost glowing. He was humming, actually humming, as he pulled clothes from the closet. He hadn't hummed in the house in years. When he noticed her sitting on the bed, he smiled at her. Actually smiled. As if nothing was wrong. As if he hadn't spent the last 6 months betraying her with someone else. As if he hadn't just told another woman that he didn't love his wife, that his marriage was a prison. "Hey," he said casually. "I'm going to have to work late again tonight. Client meeting came up. I should be back by 10 or so." Rachel nodded. She couldn't speak. If she opened her mouth, she was afraid of what might come out. Screams. Accusations. Questions that would only lead to more lies. So she simply nodded and watched him get dressed in his new clothes, watched him apply the cologne she hated, watched him check his phone with barely concealed eagerness. He kissed her forehead on his way out, the same dismissive kiss he'd been giving her for months, the kind of kiss a husband gives his wife when he's already emotionally left her. When he was gone, Rachel sat in the silent house and felt something inside her shift fundamentally. It wasn't shock. Some part of her had known. That instinct she'd been ignoring, that voice in her head that had been screaming for months, it had known. It had been right all along. What she felt now wasn't surprise. It was something colder. Something harder. Something that felt like the last fragile thread holding her to this marriage had finally snapped. She didn't cry. She didn't rage. She didn't call him and demand answers or confrontations. Instead, she sat very still and made a decision that would change everything. She was done. Not in a moment of anger or despair, but in a moment of absolute clarity. She was done waiting for him to love her. She was done hoping he would choose her. She was done believing in the person she'd thought he was. She picked up her phone and opened a new browser window. She typed 3 words into the search bar, "divorce lawyer near me." The search results populated instantly, a list of options for how to legally end a marriage. She stared at those results for a long time, feeling the weight of what it would mean to actually go through with it. But underneath that weight was something else. Relief. Possibility. The first glimpse of a future that didn't include waiting for a man who had already made his choice. He had chosen someone else. He had chosen her over his wife. And in that moment, sitting alone in the house they'd built together, Rachel made her own choice. She chose herself. And once that choice was made, there was no going back. The lie came wrapped in a tone that Rachel had come to know all too well, the careful, measured voice David used whenever he wanted her not to ask questions. It was November 15th, 3 weeks before Christmas, and he was sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop open, moving it to the side as she came in with her evening tea. "Rachel, I need to talk to you about something," he said, and she could already feel the deception in those words. The careful phrasing. The staged sincerity. She'd heard it so many times over the past months that she could practically predict what would come next. "I won't be here for Christmas," he continued, and she watched his face as he delivered the lie. He was trying to look concerned, trying to convey urgency and compassion for someone other than himself. A friend is going through something really difficult. They're going to be alone over the holidays, and they don't have anyone else. I told them I'd come stay with them for a few days, starting on the 24th. Rachel set her tea down on the counter very carefully. Her hands were shaking slightly, and she didn't want him to see. The lie was so elaborate, so well constructed, that she almost admired the effort. Almost. If it didn't involve him spending Christmas with Natasha at whatever hotel or rental property they'd booked, she might have even believed it. "Which friend?" she asked quietly. "Someone from work," he said without hesitation. "You don't know them. They're new to the firm. They've been dealing with a divorce and some family stuff. It's complicated." The irony was so sharp it cut. He was planning his own betrayal while talking about someone else's divorce. He was abandoning his marriage while claiming to be a supportive friend. The layers of dishonesty were so profound that Rachel wondered how he kept it all straight in his mind, how he managed to believe his own narratives so completely. "Where will you be?" she asked, still keeping her voice steady, still playing the role of the slightly concerned but ultimately trusting wife. "Probably their place," he said. "Somewhere up north. I'm not sure of the exact details yet. They're still figuring it out." Another lie layered on top of the first one. Rachel could see it so clearly now, the way his eyes would shift just slightly when he was being particularly dishonest. The way he'd use vague language to avoid giving her information she could verify. The way he'd constructed an entire fictional narrative designed to satisfy her without giving her anything concrete to hold on to. "Oh," she said, and she picked up her tea again, cradling the warm cup in her hands. "That's very generous of you." "I know it's not ideal," he continued, and now he was leaning forward, trying to convince her, trying to make sure she wouldn't object or ask more questions. "Christmas is our day. I know how important it is to you. But this person is really struggling, and I can't just leave them alone. I wouldn't be able to enjoy the holidays knowing they were suffering." Rachel wanted to laugh. She wanted to scream. She wanted to throw her tea across the kitchen and demand that he tell her the truth, that he stop insulting her intelligence with these transparent lies. But she did none of those things. Instead, she forced a small smile and nodded. "Of course," she said. "I understand. You should be there for them." The relief that washed over his face was instantaneous. He'd been afraid she would fight him on it, afraid she would make demands or create scenes. But Rachel had learned by now that fighting only made things worse. Fighting made him defensive. Fighting made him angry. Fighting made him pull further away. So she smiled and she accepted the lie, and she watched him relax back into his chair, satisfied that he'd managed this particular obstacle. "I'm glad you understand," he said. "I was worried you'd be upset." "No," Rachel said, and she meant it in a way he couldn't possibly understand. "I'm not upset. I think it's good that you want to help someone in need." Over the next 9 days, she waited. She watched him prepare for the trip with increasing eagerness. He packed clothes that were nicer than anything he'd wear around the house. He got his hair cut and styled. He bought an expensive bottle of wine as a gift for this mysterious friend who was suffering so much. He checked his phone constantly, his fingers moving rapidly across the screen as he texted with Natasha, making final arrangements for their Christmas getaway. Rachel watched all of this with a strange detachment. Part of her was tempted to confront him, to throw the evidence in his face, to demand that he acknowledge what he was really doing. But another part of her, the part that was already planning her exit, the part that was thinking like a woman who had already decided to leave, knew that confrontation would only complicate things. If she confronted him now, he would become defensive. He would gaslight her, tell her she was overreacting, insist that he was telling the truth. There would be fights and arguments and tears. There would be negotiations and promises and more lies. No. Rachel had made her decision the moment she saw those messages and photos on his phone. She wasn't going to waste her energy on trying to make him see the truth. She wasn't going to exhaust herself fighting for a marriage that he had already abandoned. She was simply going to let him go. On December 23rd, David packed his bag. He moved through the house with the energy of a man going towards something he wanted, not away from something he was leaving. He hugged Rachel goodbye in the kitchen, and his embrace felt already distant, already belonging to someone else. When he pulled away, he kissed her on the cheek, not her lips, never her lips anymore. "I'll miss you," he said. Rachel almost believed he meant it. Almost believed that somewhere underneath all the lies and betrayal, he still cared about her. Almost believed that this was a man worth fighting for, worth waiting for, worth one more chance. But then she remembered the messages. "She's so controlling." She remembered the photographs. She remembered the woman's name, Natasha, spoken with tenderness and desire. She remembered that he'd already made his choice. "Have a good trip," she said. And as she watched him leave, pulling out of the driveway in his car, heading toward his mistress and his lies and his Christmas that didn't include her, Rachel picked up her phone. She had work to do. Her lawyer needed documents. The realtor needed to schedule a showing. Her banker needed to set up the transfer of funds. And most importantly, she needed to arrange her own departure while he was gone, making sure that by the time he came home, there would be nothing left for him but the evidence of what he'd lost. As his taillights disappeared down the street, Rachel turned away from the window. The countdown had begun. In 2 days, she would no longer be here. In 2 days, he would come home to find that his wife, the woman he'd dismissed as controlling, the woman he'd told another person he no longer loved, had taken control of her own life in ways he couldn't have imagined. The final test was over. Hope was dead. And now the real work could begin. The moment David's car disappeared around the corner, something inside Rachel shifted. It wasn't a dramatic transformation. There were no screams or tears or dramatic gestures. Instead, what emerged was something far more powerful, a cold, crystalline clarity that had been building beneath the surface for months. An old instinct for self-preservation rose to the surface, overriding everything else. The hurt was still there. The betrayal was still there. The grief of losing the life she thought she had was still there. But underneath all of it was something stronger, the absolute, unwavering knowledge that she could not stay. She didn't cry when he left. She didn't collapse on the living room floor or fall into bed and sob into the pillows the way she might have imagined she would when she first discovered the truth. Instead, she stood very still in the kitchen, her hands resting on the counter, and she breathed. Long, steady breaths that seemed to ground her, to anchor her to the decision she'd already made. Then she picked up her phone and did something she'd been too afraid to do while he was still in the house. She searched for divorce lawyers in her area. The search results populated instantly. Dozens of names, websites, testimonials from clients who'd gone through separations and custody battles and asset divisions. Rachel scrolled through them methodically, reading reviews and biographies, looking for someone who seemed competent and calm and capable of handling what was about to unfold. She found her lawyer's name in the second row of search results, Patricia Chen from Chen and Associates Family Law. The website was clean and professional. The testimonials spoke of her calm demeanor and strategic approach. One review said, "Patricia was compassionate but ruthless when she needed to be. She protected my interests while I was too emotionally devastated to think clearly." Rachel bookmarked the site and took a breath before picking up her phone to call. It was 8:47 p.m. on a Thursday evening. Rachel wasn't sure if a law office would still be open, but she needed to try. She needed to set this in motion before she lost her nerve, before doubt crept in and convinced her that she was overreacting, that marriage counseling might still work, that she should give him one more chance. A woman's voice answered on the third ring. "Chen and Associates Family Law. How can I help you?" Rachel had planned what she would say, but the words still came out shaky. "I need to speak with Patricia Chen. I'm looking for representation in a divorce matter." "Ms. Chen is actually available for a brief consultation right now," the receptionist said. "Hold just one moment." Within 30 seconds, a different voice came on the line. Calm. Measured. Professional. This is Patricia Chen. I understand you're looking for legal representation. It took a lot of care and time to prepare and narrate this for you, so if you're enjoying it, a quick subscribe really helps and means the world to us. Alright, let's get back to it. And there, sitting in her kitchen in the house that was about to become a crime scene of her marriage's collapse, Rachel told a stranger the outline of her story. She told her about the discovery on his phone. She mentioned the affair with someone named Natasha. She explained that her husband was currently out of the house, at a Christmas getaway with his mistress, and that she had approximately 4 days to prepare her exit before he returned. Patricia listened without interrupting. When Rachel finished speaking, there was a brief silence. "I want to be direct with you," Patricia said, her voice even and calm. "What you're experiencing is a form of trauma. You've just discovered a significant betrayal, and your mind is in survival mode. That's actually good. It means you're thinking clearly rather than emotionally. But I want to make sure you understand what filing for divorce means. It's not something to rush into when you're in acute emotional pain." "I'm not in acute emotional pain," Rachel said, and she realized as she said it that it was true. "I'm actually very calm. I knew on some level that this was happening. Finding the proof didn't shock me. It just confirmed what I already knew. And now I know that staying would be the worst thing I could do for myself." Patricia was quiet for a moment. "All right," she said. "Let me ask you some questions about your financial situation, your assets, your living arrangements. And then we'll talk about what the next steps would look like." They talked for 45 minutes. Patricia asked about the house on Oakmont Drive, about their joint bank accounts, about retirement funds and investment portfolios. She asked if there were any children. There weren't. She asked about the timeline of the marriage and when they'd begun having problems. She asked if Rachel had a safe place to go once she left. Rachel answered each question methodically. She had thought through so much of this already, in the quiet moments when she was supposed to be accepting David's lies and moving forward with her marriage. She'd been making mental notes, preparing without even realizing she was preparing. "Here's what I recommend," Patricia said, once all the questions had been answered. "First, you need to document everything. Financial records, statements, property valuations. Gather what you can without being obvious about it. Second, you need to think about where you'll go. You don't want to be the one who leaves the marital home without legal protection in place. It can complicate things later. But if you feel unsafe or if you believe he'll become violent, that changes everything. Do you feel safe?" "Yes," Rachel said. "He's not violent. He's just a liar. An unfaithful liar." "Okay. So we'll do this carefully and strategically. I'll start drafting the separation agreement and the initial divorce petition. You gather documents. When you're ready to leave, we'll have everything prepared. You'll present the papers, you'll leave, and the legal process will begin. The key is preparation and timing. You want to control the narrative as much as possible." Control. Rachel liked that word. Control of her own life. Control of her own future. Control of the terms on which she left, rather than being controlled by his choices and his lies anymore. "One more thing," Patricia said. "Once you leave, you need to be strategic about communication. Don't engage in emotional conversations. Don't answer calls that demand explanations. You have your lawyer for that. Your only job is to move forward with your own life. Can you do that?" Rachel thought about the times she'd cried trying to get David to understand her feelings. The time she'd explained how much his distance hurt her, only to have him dismiss her concerns or tell her she was being too sensitive. The times she'd apologized for things that weren't her fault, just to keep the peace. "Yes," she said. "I can do that." After she hung up with Patricia, Rachel sat in the quiet kitchen and felt something settle inside her. It wasn't happiness. It wasn't even relief exactly, though there was an element of that. What she felt was purpose. She had a plan. She had a lawyer. She had a timeline. She had transformed from a woman waiting passively for her husband to choose her into a woman actively choosing herself. She spent the next 3 hours gathering documents. She went through file cabinets in the office, photocopying bank statements and mortgage documents and insurance policies. She took photos of jewelry and art and other valuable items they'd accumulated over the years. She wrote down serial numbers on electronics and property valuations she could find online. She worked with methodical precision, careful to return everything exactly as she'd found it, careful not to leave any evidence that she'd been through their financial records. By the time she finished, it was well past midnight. Rachel stood in the office and looked at the folder she'd created, everything organized, everything labeled, everything ready to hand over to Patricia. This was what power looked like. This was what reclaiming her life looked like. She climbed into bed alone, a bed she'd slept in alone for months now, even when David was lying beside her. And as she lay in the dark, she didn't think about what she was losing. She thought about what she was about to gain. A life where she didn't wait for someone to love her. A life where she didn't rationalize betrayal. A life where her worth wasn't determined by whether someone else chose her. Tomorrow she would call the real estate agent. Tomorrow she would begin the process of selling the house. Tomorrow she would take the next step toward becoming the woman she was meant to be all along, not the woman who stayed, but the woman who left, on her own terms, with her head held high. The next morning, Rachel woke with a sense of purpose that felt almost foreign to her. For months, she'd woken with dread, with uncertainty, with the exhausting weight of trying to hold together something that was actively falling apart. But today felt different. Today she had a plan. Today she had power. And today, she was going to use both of them methodically to build the life she decided she deserved. She started before 9 in the morning, while the house was still quiet, while she could think clearly without the distraction of David's presence. She opened her laptop and created a spreadsheet. It was methodical, detailed, and utterly unsexy, the kind of document that would never feature in a romantic drama or a tearful conversation. But it was exactly what she needed. Column headers, item, location, value, date photographed, notes. Row after row of their shared life reduced to data points. The engagement ring she wore, valued at $18,000. The diamond tennis bracelet he'd given her for their 10th anniversary, $12,000. The original paintings they'd collected over the years. The vintage guitar he'd bought as an investment. The artwork in the master bedroom. The antique mirror in the hallway. Every piece of value in the house, catalogued and documented. By 10 o'clock, she'd photographed every valuable item in the home. She used her phone's camera and created a separate folder on her laptop, encrypted and password protected. She took close-ups of serial numbers on electronics. She screenshotted the property tax records she found online, the mortgage documents she'd copied from the file cabinet. She gathered the insurance policies and made note of their coverage amounts. Then came the phone call to the real estate agent. The agent's name was Marcus Sterling, and he worked for Riverside Properties Group, one of the largest residential firms in the area. Rachel had researched him carefully. His reviews were excellent, his listings moved quickly, and he was known for discretion. She called from her work phone, during her lunch break, sitting in her car in the office parking lot where no one could overhear her. "I'd like to list a property," she told him. "But I need to do it very discreetly. My husband doesn't know yet, and I need to have everything in place before I tell him." Marcus, to his credit, didn't ask a lot of questions. He'd clearly handled complicated situations before. "I can definitely work with that," he said. "Let's set up a showing at your convenience. Somewhere private, somewhere your husband won't find out about." They arranged to meet the following afternoon at a small cafe called the Riverside Blend, located about 15 minutes away from her house. Rachel told David she was going to the gym after work. He barely noticed her lie. He was too busy texting Natasha, making plans for whatever activities they were enjoying while he was supposed to be helping a suffering friend. The meeting with Marcus lasted an hour. He was professional and matter-of-fact, walking her through the listing process, discussing market value, discussing the condition of the home and what repairs or updates might help it sell faster. The house on Oakmont Drive, he explained, was in good condition. The real estate market was favorable right now. He could list it within days and potentially have offers within 2 weeks. How quickly do you need this to happen? Marcus asked. As soon as possible, Rachel said. I'm planning to separate from my husband. I'll need to move out before the process becomes too complicated. Marcus nodded, showing no judgment whatsoever. I'll draw up the listing papers. You can authorize them electronically without coming into the office. We can go live with this as soon as you're ready. Over the next week, while David remained blissfully ignorant at his Christmas retreat with Natasha, Rachel moved with quiet, methodical precision. She opened a new bank account at a different financial institution, one that David had no connection to, one that he wouldn't discover by accident. She transferred funds into it gradually, amounts that wouldn't trigger alerts but that added up to a significant sum. Money that was legally hers, money that would serve as her safety net while the legal process unfolded. She consulted with a mortgage broker to understand what her financial obligations would be once the house sold. She met with a tax accountant to understand the implications of separation and eventual divorce. She researched apartments in the area, noting down prices and availability. She was building a roadmap, piece by piece, step by step. The packing was perhaps the most emotional part, though Rachel approached even this with strategic calculation. She didn't pack dramatically. There were no large suitcases, no obvious signs that she was preparing to leave. Instead, she gradually filled several cardboard boxes that she'd picked up from a liquor store downtown. She was careful about what she took. She took her personal items, her books, her journals, the jewelry that had belonged to her grandmother, the photo albums from before she'd married David. She took clothes and shoes and the small collection of art that she'd acquired before they'd met. But she left behind anything that might cause a fight or accusation. She left his belongings untouched. She left the furniture they'd chosen together. She left the decorations and the wedding gifts and the shared items that belonged to both of them. She wasn't taking fights with her. She was taking her life. The boxes fit easily in the trunk of her car, hidden behind the emergency kit and the blankets she kept there. To anyone passing by, it would look like she was simply organizing her vehicle. No one would suspect that she was systematically removing pieces of her own existence from the home she'd helped build. She gave notice at her job, but told them it was for personal reasons and that she'd be looking for something closer to where she was moving. She contacted her insurance company and began the process of separating her auto insurance from the family plan. She updated her address on her bank accounts, not to the new address yet, but to her work address, creating a layer of privacy between herself and David. She researched shelters, just in case, though she didn't believe she would need them. She reached out to an old friend, Jennifer, someone she'd grown close to years ago but had drifted apart from as her marriage consumed more of her time and energy. She didn't tell Jennifer everything, but she asked if she might be able to stay with her for a while, just temporarily, while she figured some personal things out. Jennifer, without asking too many questions, said yes immediately. Of course. You can stay as long as you need. No questions asked. Patricia Chen called with updates. The divorce petition was drafted. The separation agreement was nearly complete. All Rachel had to do was sign the papers, leave them where David would find them, and the legal machinery would begin to turn. Are you ready? Patricia asked during their final phone call before Rachel's departure. Rachel looked around the kitchen where she'd spent so many evenings waiting for a man who was never coming home. The kitchen where she'd cooked meals alone, where she'd cried into dishes, where she'd rationalized away her own worth because she was too afraid to be alone. Yes, she said. I'm ready. On December 24th, while David was still at his hotel with Natasha, celebrating the Christmas he'd chosen over his marriage, Rachel did the final preparations. She printed out all the legal documents from Patricia. She reviewed them one last time, making sure every detail was correct. She arranged them on the dining room table with the same care she would have used to set a table for an important dinner. She wrote the final letter. Not angry, not accusatory, not pleading, just truth. I have filed for divorce. You will find all necessary documents on this table. I have consulted with my attorney regarding all financial and property matters. The house is listed for sale. Do not attempt to contact me. All future communication will go through my lawyer, Patricia Chen, at Chen and Associates Family Law. I wish you well, but I will not be part of your life anymore. I have chosen peace. She signed it with her full name, Rachel N. Mitchell. Not Rachel Mitchell Hammond. Not a wife. Just herself. Then she packed her car one final time. The boxes went in first, arranged carefully so they wouldn't shift during the drive. Then came her overnight bag, already packed with everything she would need for the next few days. Then came the folders containing all her documentation. Then came her purse with the copies of the legal papers, her new bank account information, and Patricia's contact details. She took one last look around the house on Oakmont Drive. The Christmas tree was still standing in the corner, its lights still blinking. The stockings still hung above the fireplace. The home they'd built together still looked like a home, but it didn't feel like one anymore. It hadn't felt like home in a very long time. Rachel walked to the door, and she didn't look back. She simply turned the key in the lock, put her house key and her car key and the little heart-shaped key he'd given her years ago on the dining room table next to the divorce papers, and she walked out into the cold December evening. The countdown was over. The decision had been made. The preparation was complete. And now, finally, it was time to go. He came home on December 26th at approximately 2:47 in the afternoon, humming to himself, still riding the high of 3 days spent in a hotel room with his mistress. The weather had turned colder, and there was a light snow falling as he pulled into the driveway of the house on Oakmont Drive. He'd convinced himself that the trip away had been rejuvenating, that he'd had time to think and reflect on his life, and that he was now ready to face whatever came next. He hadn't thought about Rachel much while he was gone. That was perhaps the most telling detail of all. The moment he stepped inside the front door, he felt it. That same sensation he'd felt before. The wrongness, the absence, the void that comes when a place has been deliberately left. The air was different. The silence was too heavy. The light streaming through the windows illuminated a house that felt like a museum exhibit rather than a home where someone actually lived. He called her name. Rachel, I'm home. The silence that answered him was absolute. He moved through the living room, expecting to find her somewhere, in the kitchen, in the bedroom, in the office. But the house was empty in a way that went beyond simple physical absence. It felt permanently empty, abandoned, as if she'd left not just for a few hours or a few days, but with the intention of never coming back. That's when he saw the dining room table. The papers were arranged with a precision that could only be described as ceremonial. They sat in the center of the table, bathed in the soft afternoon light, organized and highlighted and impossible to miss. Divorce petition, separation agreement, bank statements, property appraisal documents, real estate listing agreement, mortgage documents, everything organized with the kind of methodical care that suggested this had been planned, meticulously and deliberately planned, for some time. His hands began to shake as he approached the table. Not from surprise, though there was an element of that. His hands shook because on some cellular level, he understood what he was looking at. This was the end. Not the beginning of negotiations or the start of a conversation about their problems. This was the end, already decided, already in motion. On top of the stack of documents lay an envelope. His name was written on it in handwriting he'd once loved to see, on birthday cards and love notes and little post-its left around the kitchen. Rachel's handwriting. Steady and measured and final. With trembling fingers, he opened the envelope and pulled out the letter. His eyes moved across the words, and with each sentence, something inside him seemed to break apart, piece by piece. I have filed for divorce. You will find all necessary documents on this table. I have consulted with my attorney regarding all financial and property matters. The house is listed for sale. Do not attempt to contact me. All future communication will go through my lawyer, Patricia Chen, at Chen and Associates Family Law. I wish you well, but I will not be part of your life anymore. I have chosen peace. It was signed simply, Rachel and Mitchell. He read it again and again, as if reading it multiple times would somehow change what it said, would somehow give him a different outcome. But the words remained the same. Cold. Final. Absolute. There was no anger in them, which somehow made them worse. There was no desperation, no begging, no emotional explosion that he might be able to argue against or talk her out of. There was only truth, stated plainly and without embellishment. He pulled out his phone and called her. The call went straight to voicemail. He called again and again. By the fifth call, he realized that she'd likely blocked him or turned off her phone entirely. He tried texting. The messages showed as delivered but were never marked as read. He sent increasingly frantic messages, first confused, then pleading, then angry, then confused again. What are you doing? We need to talk about this. Rachel, please. Let's sit down and discuss this like adults. You can't just leave. We're married. This is insane. Call me back. Please. None of the messages were answered. None of them received responses. It was as if she had simply vanished from his life, leaving only these documents and this letter as proof that she'd ever been there at all. He walked through the house in a daze, looking for any sign of her. Her closet was half empty. She'd taken her clothes but left his, leaving behind a physical representation of the life they'd shared. Her personal items were gone from the bathroom. The books on her nightstand had disappeared. Her journals, her photographs, the small collection of jewelry that had belonged to her family, all of it gone. But the furniture remained. The shared items remained. The wedding gifts and the things they'd bought together remained, creating a strange landscape of their marriage that felt like an archaeological dig through a dead civilization. In the office, he found her laptop where she'd left it, powered off and closed. On the desk beside it was a folder. Inside was documentation, photographs of every valuable item in the house, along with dates and valuations. Bank statements. Property records. Everything organized with meticulous detail. She'd been thorough. She'd been careful. She'd been methodical in a way that suggested she'd thought through every angle, every potential dispute, every complication that might arise. The realization hit him slowly at first, then all at once, with crushing force. She'd planned this. All of it. While he'd been spending time with Natasha, while he'd been telling himself that his marriage was over but he was too cowardly to actually end it, Rachel had been quietly, methodically planning her exit. She hadn't been waiting for him to leave. She hadn't been hoping he would choose her. She'd been preparing to leave him. He sank into the chair at the dining room table, surrounded by the evidence of his own destruction. The papers were there. The letter was there. The keys were there, his house key, his car key, and a small heart-shaped key he'd given her years ago, placed deliberately on the table as a final statement. She was returning everything. She was erasing herself from his life completely. She wasn't asking for second chances. She wasn't leaving a door open for reconciliation. She was simply gone. The Christmas tree still stood in the corner, its lights still blinking, still cheerful, still mocking him with their persistent optimism. The stockings still hung above the fireplace, empty and waiting for Christmas morning gifts that would never come. The wrapping paper for the gifts he'd ignored still sat in a pile by the hearth. This was supposed to have been a holiday of love and togetherness and family. Instead, it had become the moment his wife had decided that his absence, his infidelity, his fundamental failure as a husband was no longer something she could endure. He picked up the letter again and read it one more time, looking for something he could hold on to, some indication that this might not be permanent, that there was still a possibility of fixing this. But there was nothing. The words were clear and absolute. She had chosen peace. She had chosen herself. She had chosen to move forward without him. For the first time in his adult life, David understood what it meant to truly lose everything. Not gradually, not through slow erosion, but suddenly and completely. The woman who had loved him enough to step aside in bookstores and restaurants and conversations so he could have the best life possible had finally stepped aside completely. She'd walked away from him the way he'd been walking away from her for months. The only difference was that she'd done it with intentionality and finality. She'd done it strategically. She'd done it without looking back. He sat alone at the dining room table as the afternoon light began to fade, surrounded by the papers that detailed the dissolution of his marriage, and he finally, began to understand what he'd done. Not intellectually, but viscerally. Not with excuses or justifications or rationalizations, but with the crushing, inescapable weight of absolute clarity. His marriage was over. His wife was gone, and she had taken with her not just her physical presence, but any lingering doubt he might have had about who was responsible for this outcome. He had only himself to blame, and he would have to live with that knowledge for the rest of his life. The phone rang at Chen & Associates Family Law at 3:15 p.m. on December 26th. David's voice was hoarse, broken, desperate. He asked for Patricia Chen, said it was urgent, said he needed to understand what was happening. Patricia's receptionist took a message. Patricia never called him back. Instead, she sent him an email with strict instructions. All communication regarding the separation would happen through official legal channels. Do not attempt to contact Rachel. Do not attempt to contact Patricia directly. Respond to the documents through your own attorney. That was it. That was the entirety of their interaction, a message that made it clear his marriage wasn't just over, but that he'd forfeited the right to even have a conversation about it. David sat alone in the house for 2 days. He didn't sleep. He didn't eat. He simply moved through the empty rooms, trying to understand how he'd gotten here, trying to trace back the moment when his marriage had shifted from something he could take for granted into something that had disappeared completely. He replayed conversations in his mind, searching for the moment Rachel had decided to leave. Had it been when she found the messages? Had it been before that, when she'd first noticed the red flags he thought he was so carefully hiding? Had it been years ago, accumulated moment by moment until one day she simply decided she couldn't do it anymore? He thought about the divorce papers on the table and realized that they must have been sitting there waiting for him, prepared and ready, while he was in that hotel room with Natasha. While he was celebrating a Christmas that he'd chosen over his marriage, Rachel had been orchestrating her exit with a kind of precision and care he hadn't known she was capable of. It made him understand something about his wife that he'd never truly grasped. She was stronger than he'd ever given her credit for. Stronger, smarter, more strategic. While he'd been thinking of her as the woman who'd stepped back at bookstores, she'd been the woman who was capable of stepping away from an entire life. On the afternoon of December 28th, a moving company arrived at the house on Oakmont Drive. They were there to catalog the property for the estate division. David watched from the living room as strangers walked through his home with clipboards and cameras, documenting everything: the furniture, the art, the possessions that had seemed so important when they were just things they owned together. Now they looked like the remnants of a failed project, things to be divided and distributed according to legal documents rather than love or agreement. Meanwhile, Rachel was in Jennifer's guest room, which overlooked a quiet residential street in a neighborhood she'd never lived in before. The room was small and temporary and felt like absolute sanctuary. She'd spent the first night simply lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, processing the reality of what she'd done. Not with regret. There was no regret. Just the strange sensation of having stepped off a cliff and discovering that she could actually fly. Jennifer had been kind without being intrusive. She'd brought Rachel tea and left her alone when she needed solitude. She'd also wordlessly left a folder of resources on the nightstand. Information about divorce support groups, therapists who specialized in relationship trauma, books about healing and moving forward. It was the kind of support that didn't ask for details or demand emotional labor. It simply said, "I believe you, I'm here, and I've gathered some tools that might help." By the second day, Rachel had regained enough emotional equilibrium to start thinking practically about what came next. She called Patricia Chen and confirmed that David had received the documents. Patricia assured her that the divorce petition had been officially filed. The legal machinery was in motion. David would need to respond through his own attorney. The timeline would be at least 3 months, possibly longer, depending on his level of cooperation. "How is he taking it?" Rachel asked. "He's in shock," Patricia said matter-of-factly. "That's normal. He'll go through the stages: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. Eventually he'll accept that this is happening and will likely comply with the settlement agreement. People like him usually do, once they realize they don't have a choice." People like him. Rachel understood what Patricia meant. Men who'd been allowed to do whatever they wanted, who'd never faced real consequences for their choices, who'd always had women in their lives willing to accommodate them. Until they didn't. Rachel began the work of building something new. It started small. She went for walks through Jennifer's neighborhood, noticing details she'd never had time to notice before: the gardens people had planted, the architecture of different homes, the way the light fell on the street at different times of day. She went to a coffee shop and sat with a book for 2 hours without checking her phone. She called her mother and, without going into detail, told her that her marriage was ending and that she was okay. Her mother cried. Rachel held space for her grief without taking it on as her own. She started therapy with Dr. Elena Vasquez, a therapist who specialized in relationship trauma and women's empowerment. In their first session, Elena asked Rachel what she wanted to get out of their work together. "I want to understand why I stayed so long," Rachel said. "I want to understand why I kept forgiving things that shouldn't have been forgiven. I want to make sure I never do this again, never lose myself in someone else's choices." Elena nodded. "That's good work. That's the work of truly healing. Because healing isn't just about getting over what happened to you. It's about understanding yourself well enough that you don't repeat the same patterns." Over the following weeks, as the legal process moved forward and the house on Oakmont Drive prepared to go on the market, Rachel began to understand patterns she'd never noticed before. She'd grown up watching her mother prioritize her father's needs, watching her abandon her own dreams for the sake of family harmony. She'd learned early that a woman's value was measured by her capacity to sacrifice, to forgive, to make peace. Those lessons had served her well in some ways. She was kind, loyal, committed. But they'd also made her vulnerable to someone who would exploit that kindness, that loyalty, that commitment. She started journaling, writing down thoughts and realizations that came to her in quiet moments. She wrote about the person she wanted to become, not in reaction to David, not in opposition to him, but in alignment with who she actually was underneath all the accommodations and compromises. She was intelligent. She was capable. She was strong enough to make hard decisions. She was worthy of being chosen, not because she'd earned it through sacrifice and forgiveness, but simply because she existed. The house sold 3 weeks later. A young family with 2 children put in an offer on the first day it was listed. The closing was scheduled for mid-February. David signed the documents his attorney placed in front of him. He didn't fight the settlement. Rachel's lawyer had been right. Once he understood there were no other options, he complied. By late January, Rachel had moved into a small 1-bedroom apartment in the historic district downtown. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't large. But it was hers. She decorated it slowly, with intention. She hung the art she'd taken from the house. She arranged her books on shelves. She planted herbs on the windowsill, something she'd always wanted to do but never had because David said they cluttered the kitchen. She went back to work, and people noticed something different about her. There was a calm confidence there that hadn't been present before. She participated in meetings with more assertiveness. She spoke up when she disagreed. She no longer made herself smaller to accommodate others' comfort. Her boss called her into his office and asked if everything was okay. "Everything is actually better than it's been in a long time," she told him. She reconnected with friends she'd drifted away from during her marriage. She started attending a book club. She took a pottery class on Tuesday evenings and discovered that she had an aptitude for it. She fell in love with the feel of wet clay in her hands, with the meditative quality of the work, with a tangible creation of something where nothing had existed before. Healing didn't come all at once. It came in small, steady increments. Some mornings she still woke up and felt a phantom weight in her chest, the ghost of anxiety that had lived there for so long. But those mornings became less frequent. She started waking up more often with a sense of possibility instead. She received a message one day, forwarded through her lawyer, in which David asked if they could talk. Patricia advised against it. "He wants absolution," Patricia said. "He wants you to tell him you forgive him so he can stop feeling guilty. That's not your job. Your job is to take care of yourself." Rachel deleted the message without responding. She didn't hate David. She didn't harbor anger toward him. But she also understood that engaging with him, even to comfort him, would be a form of the same dynamic that had destroyed their marriage. She'd spent years taking care of his feelings at the expense of her own. She wasn't going to do that anymore. By spring, when the divorce was finalized, Rachel stood in her small apartment and felt something she hadn't felt in years: peace. Not the kind of peace that comes from everything being perfect, but the kind that comes from knowing you're exactly where you're supposed to be, doing exactly what you're supposed to be doing, becoming exactly who you're supposed to become. She thought about the version of herself who'd stood in that house on Oakmont Drive, waiting for a man to come home, hoping he would choose her, believing that her worth was determined by his love. She felt compassion for that version of herself, but also gratitude that she was no longer her. If anyone asked Rachel what she'd learned from her marriage and its ending, she would say this: "Your worth isn't determined by how long you can endure pain. Your worth isn't measured by how much you can forgive or how patient you can be or how willing you are to sacrifice your own needs for someone else's comfort. Your worth is intrinsic. It doesn't need to be earned. It doesn't need to be proven. It simply exists because you exist." The bravest thing a person can do is recognize when something is breaking them and choose themselves anyway. Not out of spite or anger or an attempt to prove something to someone else, but because you finally understand that staying in what destroys you costs far more than leaving ever could. Walking away from a marriage, from a life you've built, from promises you made, it hurts. There's grief in that. There's loss. But sometimes that loss is the only thing that makes space for something better. Sometimes destruction is the first step toward creation. I spent years waiting for someone to choose me. Now I choose myself every single day. And that, more than anything else, has set me free. Rachel poured herself a cup of tea in the kitchen of her small apartment, looked out the window at the city spreading out before her, and smiled. Not a smile of sadness or regret, but a smile of genuine contentment. The journey wasn't over. There would be more chapters to write, more growth to experience, more versions of herself waiting to be discovered. But she was no longer waiting for someone else to write the story. She was the author of her own life now. And her life was just beginning. Coming up next, you'll see 2 more stories we handpicked just for you. If this one struck a chord, you're going to love what's next. Tap to keep the journey going.